The idea of Africa rising as one united force has long captured the imagination of intellectuals, leaders, and ordinary citizens across the continent. For decades, colonial legacies, artificial borders, and foreign interference have created divisions that weakened Africa's ability to stand as a unified power. Today, however, that narrative is being challenged in powerful new ways. And one of the central figures giving voice to this bold transformation is Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. When Traoré speaks of declaring war on borders, he is not simply addressing physical boundaries drawn by colonial rulers. He is speaking to a much deeper reality, the division of African societies, economies, and identities that has held back true continental strength for more than a century. His call for unity, echoed by other Pan-African voices, represents the possibility of a historic turning point in the story of Africa. The notion of borders in Africa is itself deeply problematic because nearly every line on the map was drawn not by Africans, but by Europeans at the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885. With little regard for ethnic, cultural, or historical continuity, colonial powers carved up vast regions into arbitrary territories. Families, communities, and kingdoms that had existed for centuries were suddenly split apart and placed under different colonial administrations. When independence came in the mid-20th century, African nations inherited these artificial boundaries. Instead of serving as natural divisions, borders became barriers that restricted movement, trade, and cultural exchange between peoples who often shared the same language, heritage, or traditions. This legacy created an Africa of fragmented states, each struggling on its own to survive within a system that still largely favored the interests of external powers. Traoré's message is an unmistakable rejection of this inheritance. By calling for the dismantling of colonial borders, he is not advocating for chaos or the abolition of national identity. Instead, he is pushing for a reimagining of Africa, where the strength of the continent lies in its unity rather than its divisions. In his vision, a borderless Africa would mean unrestricted trade between states, free movement of people, greater collective security, and a shared identity rooted in common goals. It would mark a fundamental shift from dependency on foreign powers to a new era of African self-determination and continental integration. This vision resonates strongly with the historical struggle for Pan-Africanism, a movement championed by figures such as Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, Patrice Lumumba, and Thomas Sankara. Each of these leaders, in their own time, recognized that Africa could never achieve true independence or prosperity while divided. Sankara, in particular, who once led Burkina Faso before his assassination, declared that Africa must unite or perish. Traoré's rhetoric today channels that same revolutionary spirit, but in a world where the stakes are even higher. Globalization has accelerated competition for resources, markets, and political influence. Emerging powers like China, India, and Russia are increasingly active in Africa, while traditional Western powers remain heavily invested in maintaining their influence. In this context, a fragmented Africa risks being forever subjected to the interests of outsiders. A united Africa, by contrast, would have the power to negotiate on equal footing, defend its sovereignty, and chart its own course. The idea of uniting Africa by eliminating borders is not only political, but also profoundly economic. Current African economies are often small and vulnerable, overly dependent on exporting raw materials while importing manufactured goods. This system benefits wealthier nations but keeps African states in cycles of poverty. However, with unity and open borders, Africa could finally harness its full potential. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, launched in 2018, was one of the first concrete steps toward creating the world's largest free trade zone by population. Yet, progress has been slow, and many barriers remain due to infrastructure gaps, bureaucracy, and political hesitations. Traoré's call for erasing borders directly challenges these obstacles, arguing that Africa cannot afford gradualism when the world is moving rapidly toward blocs and alliances that serve their own collective interests. Consider the transformative potential of such integration. A borderless Africa would immediately unlock the power of a market of 1.4 billion people, giving rise to a massive consumer base and greater incentives for industrialization. Infrastructure projects such as trans-African highways, energy grids, and digital networks would become feasible because they would serve an integrated market rather than isolated states. Young entrepreneurs and innovators, who make up the majority of Africa's population, will be able to collaborate across borders, scaling ideas and businesses continent-wide. Moreover, food insecurity, which has often been exacerbated by trade restrictions and border delays, could be mitigated by efficient regional agricultural cooperation. In short, the economy of a borderless Africa would no longer be defined by fragmentation, but by synergy. The security implications of a borderless Africa are equally significant. Current borders often serve as weak points exploited by insurgents, traffickers, and external actors. In the Sahel, where Burkina Faso has been at the center of ongoing conflict, porous borders have allowed terrorist groups to move freely, while African militaries remain restricted by jurisdictional limitations. Traoré's call for dismantling borders therefore speaks not only to political unity, but also to collective security. A united Africa could establish stronger continental defense mechanisms, pooling resources and intelligence, ensuring that no single state is left isolated in the face of threats. Instead of fighting fragmented wars within artificial boundaries, African nations could build a continental security architecture that is proactive, robust, and sovereign. Culturally, the idea of erasing borders reconnects with Africa's deep historical identity. Before colonialism, Africa's civilizations thrived on interconnected networks of trade, culture, and migration. From the Mali Empire and Great Zimbabwe to the Swahili coast, African societies were never defined by rigid borders, but by fluid interactions and shared identities. Traoré's rhetoric evokes this historical memory, reminding Africans that division is not natural but imposed. By declaring war on borders, he is effectively calling for a return to authenticity, where Africans recognize one another as brothers and sisters first, rather than as citizens of divided states. Of course, the path to achieving such a vision is complex. There are significant challenges to continental unity, ranging from entrenched political interests to practical issues of governance. Many African leaders have grown accustomed to the sovereignty of their nation-states and may resist ceding authority to a broader union. Economic disparities between countries could create tensions over how resources and opportunities are distributed. In addition, external powers that benefit from Africa's fragmentation may actively work against efforts at integration. Traoré's challenge, therefore, is not simply in declaring war on borders, but in mobilizing both popular will and political commitment to overcome these obstacles. What makes his call especially powerful is the current mood among Africa's youth. With over 60% of the continent's population under the age of 25, there is a rising generation that is less attached to colonial divisions and more eager to embrace a shared African identity. Social media, technology, and increased awareness of global injustices have fueled this appetite for unity and self-determination. When Traoré speaks of dismantling borders, he taps into this generational energy, positioning himself not merely as a national leader, but as a symbol of continental aspiration. His words resonate far beyond Burkina Faso, igniting debates across Africa and the diaspora about the feasibility and urgency of unity. On the international stage, the prospect of a borderless Africa would be nothing short of revolutionary. Global powers have long exploited Africa's divisions to secure favorable trade deals, military bases, and resource access. A united Africa would have the leverage to renegotiate these arrangements, set its own terms, and pursue partnerships that align with its interests. In global institutions such as the United Nations, World Trade Organization, or International Monetary Fund, a unified African bloc would carry enormous influence, representing over a quarter of the world's countries and a significant share of its population. Such a block would be impossible to ignore and could fundamentally alter the balance of global power. Critics might dismiss Traoré's vision as unrealistic or overly idealistic. They may argue that the diversity of Africa, its thousands of languages, cultures, and traditions, makes unity impossible. Yet this critique misunderstands the essence of his call. Unity does not mean uniformity. It does not erase diversity, but embraces it as a strength. Just as the European Union or ASEAN have managed to build cooperative structures despite deep differences, Africa too can design models of integration that respect local identities while advancing common goals. Traoré's call for eliminating borders is not about erasing nations, but about transcending the limitations imposed by colonial geography in order to embrace a higher identity, that of being African. The symbolic power of his words cannot be overstated. At a time when the world is witnessing the resurgence of nationalism, protectionism, and geopolitical rivalry, Africa's message of unity and solidarity offers an alternative vision for the future. A borderless Africa would stand as a beacon of hope, showing that humanity can overcome division and create structures that serve the collective good. For Africans themselves, this vision offers dignity, pride, and empowerment after centuries of exploitation and marginalization. Ultimately, the success of this movement will depend not only on the words of leaders like Traoré, but on the actions taken by African governments, institutions, and citizens. It will require bold policies, courageous reforms, and persistent advocacy to transform the dream of unity into reality. It will demand investment in infrastructure, education, and technology to bridge the divides that borders once symbolized. Most importantly, it will call for a deep commitment to the principle that Africa's future lies not in the fragmentation of yesterday, but in the solidarity of tomorrow. As Traoré declares war on borders, the world is forced to pay attention. His voice joins a chorus that is growing louder across the continent, one that insists Africa will no longer be defined by lines drawn in foreign capitals. The rise of a united Africa may not happen overnight, but its seeds are being planted today in the hearts of millions who believe in the possibility of a different future. If history has taught us anything, it is that ideas are powerful forces, and the idea of a borderless Africa, once dismissed as a utopian dream, is now emerging as a revolutionary reality in the making. In this moment, Africa stands at a crossroads. The choice is clear: continue along the path of division and dependency, or embrace the difficult but transformative journey toward unity. Traoré's declaration is more than rhetoric. It is a call to action, a rallying cry for an entire continent to rise and reclaim its destiny. If Africa answers this call, the world will witness not just the dismantling of borders, but the birth of a new power, an Africa united, sovereign, and ready to shape its own destiny.